It's time to talk about failure, and since this is the third attempt at this video, I guess I'm qualified. Cheers. Welcome back everybody to me talking about book-adjacent things, and today we'll be talking about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, some other things like Conan, Lord of the Rings, philosophy, theology, politics, that kind of stuff. It all meshes together, but it's mostly Malazan things that I'll mention. In particular, stuff from Deadhouse Gates, House of Chains, and one small but very important element from The Crippled God. So consider yourself warned, there might be spoilers ahead. With that, out of the way, if you disagree with me, please yell at me in the comments. I really thrive on adversity. And we'll come back to that as well. So, let's start the whole thing by opening some old wounds and looking at some history. A while ago, there was a bit of a kerfuffle online about the character of Felisin from Deadhouse Gates and House of Chains. Some fans were very vocal about their disagreement or dislike for the character. One might even call it hatred, visceral hatred. And, it kind of burned for a while, and it comes up again and again, and you can probably say that Felisin is one of the more divisive characters in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And that's always puzzled me. It puzzled me at the time, it still puzzles me, or sort of, why people dislike her so much. And, this is an attempt at looking at that. Because, see, I found her annoying the first time I read it, and then I realized that was wrong. And now I just feel, well, compassion for her character. And then I realized, doing some self-reflection, as I'm sometimes doing in the middle of the night or whatever, that I behave towards friends or people I know in a similar way. And that is, when I perceive, or when I think, or feel, or believe that these people I know are not actually doing the things I expect them to do, or I want them to do. In particular, being successful in life, when I figure out, that they should get that job, they should do this thing, and it's very easy to then condemn them for not trying hard enough, for not doing enough, and it's an impulse, and I hate it in myself very much that I have that impulse. And this is a video about why I think we need to talk about that, and why fantasy does sometimes make this impulse harder, because it's an impulse that we should not have. Usually I try to, override it on a rational level, but we're talking about impulses that, happen somewhere in the subconscious. So this is what we'll be talking about today. And before we go further, we have to talk about words. Alright, I'll be using the word weakness a lot here, and I don't like the word, because, see, the word weakness has some very bad negative connotations. It's paired with the word strength, and we kind of like strength, and we really, really, really don't like weakness. And the problem there is that weakness is not just a lack of strength, of physical strength, the strength to, bend bars and lift gates, as they say on an AD&D character sheet, but it is more than that, because we define strength oftentimes as our ability to achieve goals, to overcome adversity in our world. And that means it's not just brawn and muscle, it's also what we call strength of will, and moral strength, and other less tangible forms of strength. Or, and this is the point, right? We don't necessarily say that someone has a strength, we use the word strength of will, but sometimes we just focus on moments when we fail at that, and someone has a weak will, or other forms of weakness. And we condemn that, because failure has a moral connotation to it. And being weak, or failing, in our world is seen as wrong, as bad, as morally wrong. And suddenly, having a weakness of will, or a moral weakness, is seen as a moral weakness. And we're really good at condemning people for what we consider to be wrong. And this is what we'll be grappling with, but for now, let's just define weakness as our inability to overcome adversity, an inability to achieve goals. And we'll come back to the question, who sets these goals, in a moment. But this is what I talk about when I talk about weakness, and I think that's a problem because of that moral connotation. But let's move on and see where we move with fantasy literature. Because, well, I've said this before, books, fiction, influences our way of looking at the world. And since this is talking about fantasy books, we have to talk about how fantasy books do that. They have many qualities. They can be used as escapism. They can be used as a didactic tool. Just ask, your C.S. Lewis or whomever. And they can be used as anything in between. But whenever we read a book, we, as the reader, get changed by that book. And we take in some of the ideas in that book, and we take them into ourselves, into our hearts and souls, and in our ways of thinking. Not often, and sometimes into our, intuitive ways of thinking, not our clear, rational thoughts. So, with that out of the way, let's look at weakness and overcoming adversity in fantasy. We'll do a bit of a trip through history before we end up with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, so bear with me, and let's look at one Robert Irving Howard and his Conan of Cimmeria. Now, Robert E. Howard wrote a bunch of pulp stories back in the 1920s and 1930s. He's one of the most popular and most influential pulp writers in the more fantastic sword and sorcery field. There's a very old video I made about Conan. I'll link it down below. Please be aware it's like my second or third video I ever made, so it's probably not very good. Even worse than this one. Anyway, so Robert E. Howard wrote Conan of Cimmeria. We all kind of have an image of that character, and what is interesting here is that Conan does have strength. It's in fact all he has. Conan overcomes adversity in every single story through his sheer force of will connected to his physical strength. And they are connected for Howard. Conan, finds himself somewhere in a desert, having a loincloth if he's lucky, nothing much more. And then he wanders into some place, has to free a scantily clad woman, and beat some really terrible monster with, violence. And that's all they are. They are power fantasies of an individual character overcoming all adversity and enforcing his will on the world. In fact, they are escapism. They are, as I said, a power fantasy. And for that, we need to offend we need to offend Roland Barthes and look at the author for a moment. See, Robert E. Howard was not a very happy person. Robert E. Howard took his own life, aged 30, when his mother died. So we can see that he certainly struggled with enforcing his will on the world. And Conan and some of his other characters are certainly a form of escapism for him, in a way, describing the man he would love to be, up to a point, because obviously he wrote some critical things about the idea of a barbarian. We'll come back to the barbarian trope later, but I want to acknowledge that I'm aware of the fact that Robert E. Howard did not want to be a barbarian. He just wanted to be someone able to actually achieve his goals and impress his will on the world. So he wrote about characters who do that, and he was very successful with that, up to a point in the measurements of pulp writers of the 1930s. So that's one person and one character, and I want you to keep this one in mind as an archetype. And we move on to another very successful fantasy writer, that being one John Ronald Royal Tolkien from the United Kingdom. See, Tolkien wrote a lot, and we'll be looking at The Lord of the Rings today. We'll be looking at two aspects of The Lord of the Rings here. And two characters or bits here. Let's start with the first one, the one that directly addresses strength and weakness. See, there's a character in Lord of the Rings that usually doesn't get mentioned as a beloved character or anything of that sort, and that is Denethor, High Steward of Gondor. And Denethor, well, obviously he fails in a lot of ways, and it's very clear why, and I think it's important to look at that. See, Denethor acknowledges his weakness. He realizes his weakness. Denethor is not able to muster an army large enough to defeat Sauron. It's very clear that he is not. But he believes that he has to do this, more or less on his own, because no one else will help him. So, when he is offered help, he does not actually take that help, because that help is coming from above. It's coming from a higher being. In this case, it's Gandalf, and he does not put his trust into Gandalf. Instead, when all seems lost, he once again goes out in a blaze by, taking his own life. Now, it's important to understand that Tolkien was a Catholic, and it's important that he's a Catholic and not just a Christian here. And one important aspect of this is that acknowledging weakness is something that at least some parts of Christianity are very, accept. You have to acknowledge your weakness. vis-a-vis the world. And then you have to put your trust into God, into a higher power. And that's that second part that, he fails at, Denethor fails at, because he does not put his trust, and he accepts his weakness, he acknowledges his weakness, but he does not put his trust in a higher power. Instead, he despairs. And we can see that, once again, with his two sons, Boromir and Faramir. Boromir, once again, decides to do things by himself. He lacks that trust to a higher power. Instead, he tries to gain enough strength to overcome the world. We all know how that ends. He tries to take a ring, he dies. His brother Faramir, however, is the model here, because he decides to put his trust in Gandalf, and he gets rewarded for that. So there is an acknowledgement of weakness, whereas, Robert E. Howard does not even acknowledge weakness unless it's, Conan's opponents who have weaknesses and get punished for them. Tolkien acknowledges weakness. He just comes to the conclusion that we need to trust a higher power. But he has a second answer here, and I think the second part is also important, and that is the question of the individual. See, when we talk about Conan, Conan is always alone, whereas The Lord of the Rings talks about a fellowship, the fellowship of the ring. And this is the really important second part that I want to point to. Because, well, it's always done by a group, right? We call it the fellowship. When Frodo wants to set out on his own, Gandalf tells him no, and he sends Sam with him. And when Frodo decides to leave together with Sam on his own, well, Peregrine and Meriadoc and Fredegar try to help him. And then we have other companions along the way. We come to the Council of Elrond, and all these people come together as a fellowship, because no one can do this on their own. We can't actually achieve all our goals on our own. We need to rely on the help of others. Mutual aid is the important point here. And maybe that's the reason why J.R. Tolkien called himself an anarchist at some point. We'll come back to that. So that's the second important aspect. On the one hand, we should acknowledge our weaknesses and put our trust in a higher power, or also accept the fact that we are always part of a fellowship, of a group of people. It's never just about the individual, which you can see when you ask people who they think is the hero of The Lord of the Rings. Some people will say Aragorn, because he becomes king. Some people will say Frodo, because, he brings the ring all the way to the mountain. Some people will say Sam Gamgee. And the point is, I would probably say maybe it's Gollum. And all of these answers are correct, because none of them is the individual hero. So the question is, what changed, and why does so much fantasy have individual heroes afterwards? And for that, we need to look at, well, fantasy in one way, which is that most of contemporary fantasy, or modern fantasy from the 1950s onwards, is sort of a combination of these two strains of fantasy. The American pulp strain of your Robert E. Howards, your Conan, your Coles, your Brian McMorrans, and on the other hand, the epic fantasy of J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And they are kind of mixed and matched for a long time. That's the two strands of the DNA of a lot of contemporary fantasy. But there's something that happened, and for that we get to blame neoliberals, evangelical Christians, and Joseph Campbell, some of my three most favorite people to blame in the world. So let's look at that and do some politics for a moment. Because the question is, where does the idea of the individual come from? And fantasy as a literature is a literature of the 20th century. Don't let people tell you that, mythology is basically just fantasy. It's not. Fantasy as a modern form of literature is something of the 20th century. And the 20th century is very much the century of the individual, of individualism. And there's different reasons that kind of all came together into what we are, living through now, which is the highly individualized postmodern era. For that, we need to look at three main ideas. The first one is Calvinist Christianity. ending in evangelical Christianity. And we'll have to talk about that because, yes, mostly that happens in the US at these points, but the American, North American and also parts of the British English-speaking world have a cultural hegemony and have influenced very much of fantasy published, written, and, published and read throughout the 20th and early 21st century. So we need to look at those people. And one important thing about Calvinist theology is the point about grace and predestination. What that means is that if you have grace, in their idea, ends with stuff like prosperity gospels, is that if you have grace, God gives you grace, you will succeed in life. So success in life, worldly success, overcoming adversity, achieving your goals, that is seen as a sign of God's grace. Now, on the other hand, if you fail in life, you suffer all kinds of adversities, you can't overcome them. That is obviously seen as a sign that God has not given you grace. And in a religious context, that means that there's a moral blemish on you, that you are morally condemned in some form or other. And that makes it all right to hate on you. So we have that aspect, that religious aspect in there, which praises signs of success, wealth, and so forth as a sign of God's grace, and condemns lack of success in these worldly matters as a lack of grace. That's pretty dangerous. But we can move on from that and look at a second strain, and that is the second strain of liberalism and mostly neoliberalism. That being, obviously, a focus on the individual and everything we do. If an individual has ultimate freedom to do whatever they want, they stand and fall on their own merits. All we achieve by will and force alone. And all we fail at, that's a personal failure. So it's once again okay to hate people that fail, and love, or at least adore people, praise people that succeed. And the way we do that is by measuring up worldly goals. Success in money, wealth, all these things. These are seen as a sign of a strong will and the ability to actually overcome weaknesses and show strength in the world. And, you look out there and look at ideas in the world, look how we look at billionaires and so forth, and you can see how that has had a huge influence on the world we live in. You don't even have to go and read Ayn Rand. In fact, I hope you don't, because she didn't write good books, but that's the extreme part, is the ideology of Ayn Rand's libertarianism. But even in, your Hayeks, your Milton Friedmans, you find that same idea, that since we're all individuals, we stand and fall according to our own merits, and these merits are obviously morally connotated. All right, that's the second part. Now let's look at the third part, which is Joseph fucking Campbell and the hero's motherfucking journey. I've talked about it before. It's an important book, whether you agree with it or you don't, like me. It still is a hugely influential text on the fantasy writing, science fiction writing in general. So the book is called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Joseph Campbell wrote it. He collects a ton of mythologies and claims there is one story in there which he calls the monomyth, and that is about the hero's journey. We say the hero because Joseph Campbell only talks about men in this regard. Women don't get to be heroes for Campbell. So let's stick with that. So the hero's journey is about one man hearing the call to adventure, going out, facing adversity, having some people that help him along the way, guides and so forth, going down into the belly of the whale, facing the darkness, and coming back a changed and better man to bring benefit to society. And it's a compelling story. It's wrong, but it's compelling. So it makes also for good stories, right? We all seen Star Wars. We kind of see how that is fun, right? Someone overcoming adversity. It's nice to cheer on people that overcome adversity. On the other hand, it's all about an individual. It's a hero's journey. It's not a group of heroes. It's one person that succeeds, one man that succeeds. And since so much of fantasy was patterned after this book, because people read it as a writing guideline, as, a book that teaches you how to write stories. A lot of stories afterwards are all about one hero overcoming odds. Yeah, they have, people on their side, but that's it. There is unfortunately a darker side to this, because Joseph Campbell did not write a writing manual. Joseph Campbell tried to write a self-help book. The hero's journey is about human psychology, about all our personal journeys of overcoming adversity and growing in the act of overcoming adversity, becoming the heroes of our own stories. Joseph Campbell wrote to explain how people should live, not how people should write stories. And that's because he was a, devotee of Carl Jung, who was a devotee of Friedrich Nietzsche, and also was a bit of a Nazi and a lot of other terrible things, and started a cult, that he called depth psychology. And Carl Jung is also about exploring your inner dark side. You have the archetypes in there and so forth. And you come back a changed man and a better man. If you're a woman, probably Carl Jung would start an affair with you, but this is not the Carl Jung video that I should probably never make. Anyway, so the problem that we have is that a lot of fantasy gets patterned after a self-help book, that is about the individual journey, overcoming adversity and becoming a better person. And what that leads to is that fantasy takes epic fantasy's framework of the Lord of the Rings, the epic scale, the world entirely in danger and so forth, but replaces a group of people, of average people, hobbits and so forth, trying to do something about it, or putting their trust into higher powers. It replaces that one with the Conan narrative, the narrative of an individual enforcing their will upon the world, which is the archetype of the hero's journey, with all the Nietzschean overtones of misreading old Friedrich. And that's so much of fantasy that came afterwards, because, that's the spirit of the times of the 50s and 60s in a lot of ways, in a time when the idea of collective action, of collectivism, was seen as communist, and we're in the beginnings, or well, the heights of the Cold War. So individual stories are what overlap with epic fantasy. And you see that. You read your Dragonbone Chair, your Memory, Sorrow, Thorn trilogy, Ostenard, whatever you want to call it, by Ted Williams. Yes, there are characters in there, but the main hero is Simon. You read the Wheel of Time series. Yeah, there's a lot of characters in that series, but it's all about Rand at the end of the day. And there's more of these stories. And that is where that focus on the individual hero overcoming odds and loving strength and abandoning and despising weakness comes into so much of fantasy. However, that does not, stay completely, because it turns out the world that we live in does not necessarily work that way. Individuals don't succeed. There's always the chance that whatever we do, no matter how hard we try, we will fail. And that is where we come to the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, and grimdark fantasy. Because grimdark fantasy has characters showing all the strength they have and all the good intentions they have and still failing. A Logan Ninefinger completely fails. Joe Abercrombie is a perfect example for that, because what it ends with is dark humor, ironic distance, cynicism, and fatalism. The expression of, well, the end of the boom of neoliberalism, when we realize that that promise has been broken and individuals can't succeed no matter how hard they try. And all that's left is, well, ironic distance. You just have to look out into the world, watch any form of media, and you see that that is very much the tone of the late 90s, the early 2000s, is that tone of ironic distance. And yeah, that doesn't solve the problem, does it? But I would suggest that there is another answer, and that answer can be found in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and I want to look at two characters here. And these are the characters of Felisin, once again, and Karsa Orlong. And my problem is that I wanted to make this video about Felisin. It's obviously what I started with. And then I also have to talk about Karsa, and I want to make sure that Karsa does not overshadow Felisin. So let's try that. Because the story of Felisin is a story of failure, because someone, in this case Felisin, is left to her own devices in a world that she is very much incapable of overcoming. The adversities she has to face, she's very much incapable of overcoming, and the people that could potentially help her are not doing so. They're in fact blaming her for failing. You look at her guard, you look at old no hands, or ghost hands later on. You look at the people that she's with. And they blame her for taking drugs. They blame her for doing all the things that she does because they see her weakness as a moral failing and as the lack of trying to pull herself up by her bootstraps to actually get things done. And that is a terrifying and a sad story. And the problem is, why do people hate her for that? For actually spelling out the fact that we can't succeed on our own as individuals in this world. And I think partly that is because it shows us the fear of being in that position. On the other hand, if we have overcome some adversities, we sometimes feel like we could overcome all adversities. It's something you find in a lot of, your Sheryl Sandbergs, you're like, women aren't trying hard enough. People with disabilities aren't trying hard enough. It's the survivor bias in there. It's either that, or it is the fear that we might actually also be too weak. We're blaming our own failures to achieve our own goals, or the goals that society has set for us. We're blaming those on that character. There's a lot of self-hatred going on there when we hate Felisin. And that's despicable. And now, let's look at Karsa for a moment, because I think it's important to come back to that. Karsa Orlong is very much a commentary, a subversion of Conan the Barbarian. He starts out as an individualist. You read the beginnings of House of Chains, and you see how his individualism actually kills the people around him, his so-called followers. They're obviously not, but, kills people around him. And over time, when he serves or works with Felisin, he still doesn't know how to deal with weakness, because that's not his... Well, he is the pure individualist with all the despise, all the hatred for weakness. And he kind of abandons Felisin. He decides that he can't actually help her. Maybe he's right, maybe he's not. But he leaves her to die. And that is tragic. However, there's a second part. He gets a second chance as redemption, despite being, a massive dickhead in so many ways. And that is the end of The Crippled God, when he meets Munog. And, he holds him in his arm and he says that, in his village, no one is a stranger. No one will die alone, and he can give that comfort. And that's something that we've lost in cities. So Karsa does go through that whole thing. He starts out as the archetypical imaginary barbarian, the Nietzschean uber-barbarian of a Conan story. But he ends up realizing that that is not how it actually works, which is, I guess, where, Stephen Erickson's background in anthropology comes through. Your David Graeber's Dawn of Everything kind of comes through. Because these kind of societies are societies of mutual aid, of mutual help. And when becoming a full barbarian, and not the imaginary barbarian of Conan, of a Robert E. Howard, that's when Karsa becomes someone who shows compassion and empathy for others and actually embraces them. And that's the thing that we should learn from Karsa Orlong, which is show compassion to those who need it. Help Felisin, show compassion to characters like Felisin, and show compassion to ourselves when we don't manage to succeed in the things we want to succeed. Because that's the other part that is important to understand. Success is measured by others. And when we measure our own success, we do it from a perspective of the other. We set goals for ourselves, and we set goals for others. But the goals we set for ourselves are usually goals we want others to see us succeed in. And failing at that is not a moral failing. It's just the fact that if we try to do things all on our own, we sometimes can't do that, because the world is out there and it's huge. The universe is a big place, and we're just like one small person in it. So that's where I think it is important to understand what Felisin does, because compassion for Felisin, staying with these people, is way more important than being big, strong, brawny barbarian. It's when we give up that strength to someone else, when we give that help to someone else, when we embrace that someone else and give them empathy and compassion, that's when we actually become fully human. And I want to end this with another quote from one Terry Pratchett, whom I do kind of like, from his book, We Free Men, when we hear the quote by one Granny Aching, who has sadly departed, and she says, "Them as can do has to do for them as can't, and them as could speak." No, wait, I'm getting this wrong. Them as can has do for them as can't, and someone has to speak for them as has no voices. And I think that's a powerful thing to live by, because what we do when we write these stories, we give them voices that have no voices, and those are the people that we are eager to abandon. And when we do that, when we hate characters like Felisin, that's when we're silencing the people that already have no voice. So what I want you to take away from this is, help others, show empathy and show compassion to yourself, show empathy and compassion to others, and let's do this all together, and not as individuals, because individuals fail, and they die alone, and no one wants that. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Let me know your thoughts down there. If you want to help me out, there's, subscribing, liking, sharing. There's some links if you really want to help me out and give me some money. I'm certainly pretty poor at the moment, so I do appreciate that as well, but, no obligations there. And yeah, let's discuss in the comments. And once again, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.